In this video, we're going to look at how to undertake an electrical installation condition report, as introduced with Amendment number 1 of the 17th edition of the wiring regulations, in this case on a dwelling.
It's important to point out that this is still periodic inspection and testing, as required by Chapter 6.2 of the regs, and the electrical installation condition report form replaces the old periodic inspection report form.
So what's the thinking behind this change then, Tony?
Well, for years, when I've been talking about PIRs, I've always told people that what they're doing is reporting on the condition of that installation. So the change of name really makes sense, especially to the recipient, who in many cases is not going to be an electrical expert.
But it's important to realise that it's more than just a change of name. There are a considerable number of changes from the old periodic inspection report form, which we'll investigate and put into practice throughout this video. So the first questions we need to ask ourselves are: what is periodic inspection and testing? Why do we need to do it? When do we need to do it? And finally, who can do it?
Periodic inspection and testing is necessary because, like everything else, electrical installations deteriorate with age. And of course, with a domestic installation, there's also the possibility of DIY electrical work, which, after some of the bodge-ups I've seen, can be lethal.
Give us a couple of examples, Tone.
Well, I've seen sockets wired in bell wire, open connector blocks, and in one house, the guy had actually rewired the house himself. He didn't have any joint boxes, so he just twisted the cables together and put them under the floor without even any tape on them.
That's horrific. God. So, carrying out an electrical installation condition report, EICR, will let us know whether or not the installation is safe for continued use. To achieve a satisfactory conclusion, the installation must pose no immediate threat of electric shock and burns or fire risks, and must not have deteriorated in any other way which could be dangerous. The checks will also determine whether the installation does not meet the current edition of the wiring regulations BS 7671.
It's important to remember that although the EICR will point out where the installation doesn't comply with the current edition of the regs on the day you do the report, the main focus is whether the installation is safe for continued use. Its purpose isn't just to generate a list of remedial work to bring the installation up to date.
So each observation should describe a specific defect, omission or item for which improvement is recommended, but should not specify what the remedial work should be. For example, it would be acceptable to say excessive damage to the consumer unit enclosure, but not consumer unit to be replaced.
To specify the level of defect found, the regulations specify 3 classification codes: C1, C2 and C3.
C1 is the code indicating that users of the installation face an immediate risk of injury and means danger present. The code on an EICR means that immediate remedial action must be undertaken. C2 indicates that the installation is potentially dangerous, meaning that users of the installation may be at risk. This level of defect requires remedial work to be undertaken as a matter of urgency. The final code is C3 and means improvement recommended. This means that users of the installation are at no immediate or potential danger, but that remedial action would contribute to a significant improvement in the safety of the installation.
When the person who undertakes the EICR fills out the final report, they will make an overall assessment of the condition of the electrical installation, and if any defect is classified as either a C1 or C2, the installation must be given an overall assessment of unsatisfactory.
Tom, with regard to the C1 code, what would you do if you found a defect of that level?
Well, a common cause of a C1 is an exposed live part. It could be a fuse board with blanks missing, where fingers can get inside. It could be a broken socket. These cannot be left for the full report to be completed before pointing out the danger to the client, verbally if possible, and then confirmed in writing.
Yeah, but Tony, the big problem is, what do you do if you tell the client and they just don't want to know?
Unfortunately, Dave, this has happened to me more than once. I remember a cupboard under the stairs with live cables hanging out of the switch fuses. I pointed this out to the householder, saying I was very worried because he had small children in the house, and he simply stated, "I'll keep the door shut."
So what do you do in that situation?
Well, you can issue an electrical danger notification form to the client which notifies them of the issue and tells them what needs immediate remedial action.
So that's not really ideal, as the danger still exists and you have no idea if it'll ever be rectified.
Well, if the client is unwilling to allow you to remove the danger, then you've really done all you can. And the electrical danger notification does therefore fulfil a legal role, known technically in Latin as rectum protectum.
Yes, and that's arse covering for the layman amongst us. So the next question, Tone, is when is the EICR carried out?
Well, there are many reasons that may require an EICR to be carried out in a domestic property. The most common is when a property changes owner or occupier. Obviously, the new owner wants to make sure that the installation is safe, and a poor electrical installation condition report could result in some final negotiations over the purchase price.
Although it isn't a statutory requirement, the IET guidance notes recommend that homes have an EICR at least every 10 years. And when you consider the consequences of a fire caused by electricity, and that thousands of fires happen every year, in many cases preventable if the installation had been in good condition, it makes sense to have your electrics checked.
Let's face it, an EICR is just like an MOT. When your car starts to get old, you get it checked every year. And how long are you in your car every day compared with being in your home?
For landlords, there may be some statutory requirements for EICRs to be undertaken, depending on the country and region you're in. For example, in parts of the UK, there's the Landlords and Tenants Act 1985, which requires that the electrical installation in a rented property is safe when the tenancy begins and maintained in a safe condition throughout the tenancy.
Furthermore, the Management of Houses in Multiple Occupation England Regulations 2006 require that every fixed electrical installation in an HMO is inspected and tested at intervals not exceeding 5 years by a person qualified to undertake such inspection and testing.
So, Tone, what does qualify someone to be able to undertake a periodic inspection and test?
Well, the person who undertakes this must be a competent person. Now, you will find this as a definition in the regs.
But also, there's a good description on the Electrical Safety Council's Best Practice Guide on Electrical Installation Condition Reporting, which is freely downloadable and is a handy thing to have printed out or indeed on your smartphone. A competent person, as far as periodic inspection and testing goes, needs to have extensive knowledge and experience of the type of electrical installation being inspected and tested so that they can safely and accurately assess its condition.
So what we are saying here is that some electricians who have experience of periodic inspection reporting only in a factory would not be the right person to do it at home, and vice versa. Just remember, in a factory you may have many different wiring systems. You might have power track, lighting track, conduit, trunking, single cables, so they require very much different approaches. And don't forget, in a factory you're more likely going to have good diagrams and circuit charts, which you might not get in the home.
And does a competent person need to know about older versions of the wiring regulations?
It could be a great advantage. Although you might be competent in inspection and testing for initial verification, a periodic requires a completely different approach. In many cases, it's a bit like being a detective. And the more experience you have of older regulations, installation techniques, and even building techniques can really be of great benefit to the person carrying out the report.
So we now know what it is, why we do it, when we do it, and who can do it. So can we just go on site now and start our EICR?
Not quite. The first thing we need to consider is what we need to take with us.
So what equipment do we need to take with us when conducting an electrical installation condition report?
Well, I don't think we need to go into it in detail, but the main thing to point out is that we need to be professional in our approach. So taking the right equipment, whether a basic repair toolkit, a step ladder, tools or test equipment is essential. There's nothing worse than having to ask the householder if they have a torch we can borrow.
So with regard to recording the results, what do you recommend, Tony?
Well, I'm going to be taking along a colour photocopy of the NICEIC Domestic Electrical Installation Condition Report form. I'm going to be taking a sketch pad for me to do a few layout drawings, making a note of the number of points, readings and of course any comments that I have.
Although not a requirement of the regs, having a layout drawing of the installation speeds up the process and can be a handy reference source for the inspector and also the client.
The great thing about a sketch is not only that you can easily see if you've missed anything, but also if you or another person comes along to do the next EICR, it will help you identify if alterations have been carried out and also what items you need to inspect next time around.
Obviously, for a small installation, you're only going to need a couple of drawings. This can be scaled up for commercial or industrial EICRs, but of course you should find as-fitted drawings anyway, which will do most of the work for you.
And it's a good idea to take photos of any defects you find, which of course will be included in the final report for the client. I'm not a defect.
I think you're a C1. Now, an example of an electrical installation condition report can be found in the model forms in Appendix 6 of the 17th edition, and these forms are actually perfectly fine to use. However, there are refined versions available.
With the NICEIC forms, you'll find some additional information will be required, which should make it more user-friendly. And it's interesting to point out that the NIC domestic report has gone from 4 pages to a minimum of 7.
Okay, TC, let's get on site.
You sure I'm not a C3? Improvement required.
A lot. We're at the property which is about to undergo an electrical installation condition report. It's been requested because the house is about to go on the market, and Tony's inside having a chat with the existing owner to find out some more information about the property, including the age of the electrical installation. Have there been alterations or additions? Are there any known defects? Are there accessories that are inaccessible because they're behind heavy furniture? And are there any previous documents relating to the installation? For example, an electrical installation certificate or a periodic inspection report. Tony will also explain to the occupier that at times the power will need to be switched off, which will mean that clocks and the like will need resetting at the end of the day. So how's it looking, Tony?
Well, this property has only had one occupier and is about 6 years old. So the installation was installed when the 16th edition was current. We do have an electrical installation certificate, which is handy, and I've drawn diagrams for each floor. I've done a separate one for the kitchen and a separate one for the garage, marking all the accessory points, including those which are inaccessible. And there are a couple actually we can't get at.
Now, because we have previous documentation, including test results for this installation, it would be possible to undertake a sampling process to the required electrical testing, in addition to the sampling of visual inspections, which would normally be expected for periodic inspection and testing, and complies with Regulation 621.2, which we'll look at later.
For testing, sampling can only be carried out if we have previous test results, and would mean, for example, that I would only undertake tests on, say, a minimum of 20% of the circuits. Bearing in mind that if the results that I get differ from those recorded, then I may increase my sampling of testing perhaps up to 100%.
If we didn't have previous results, then sampling must not be done, because if we do say only 20% of the circuits, we'd have absolutely no idea of the condition of the remaining 80%, which, thinking about the MOT of your car again, would you be happy if only 20% of it was checked? Therefore, parts of it could be dangerous, as could your electrical installation.
It's important to remember that the extent of the electrical installations covered by the EICR will need to be filled into page 1 of the report. But a major change from the old PR is how the inspector now needs to deal with limitations.
We now have 2 boxes for limitations. One dealing with agreed limitations, which now must include the reason for a limitation and who they were agreed with, and the other for operational limitations. So these are big changes from the old PIR, Tony. And first, why do we need to have a reason?
Well, before, I think many limitations were imposed upon the client without them knowing why, and certainly were never agreed. There is one agreed limitation I would expect to see on nearly every EICR, and that is no insulation resistance testing between line and neutral. The reason is that it is impracticable to remove every piece of current using equipment out of the circuit. And this will be explained to and agreed with the client, in this case, the householder.
And what is the operational limitations box for, Tony?
Well, sometimes when you go on site, you've agreed in advance with the client what you can and can't do. And then unfortunately, you find something that you can't check, perhaps because you can't get access. So this gives us a place to record limitations which have not been agreed, but which cannot be avoided. Now, Dave, what we want to do is to go and check the accessories, what circuit they're on, and it's so much easier with two of us.
Lead on. To your cupboard, Mr. Cable.
Thank you.
Tony's already done some preparation work in the house, and all the lights have been turned on everywhere. We've also unplugged any appliances to avoid any sockets interfering with later live testing. So now what we're going to do is turn off all the breakers and then bring them on one by one and find out which circuit that breaker energizes. So Tony, if you'd like to turn them all off. Garage on. Yeah, landing all right? Yep, heater's on.
Okay, I'm out of the meter cupboard ready to start. Now obviously this is still live, but the consumer unit has been locked off and checked for dead.
Safe isolation is very important and can be more involved than you may think. So we've covered it in another video, which is recommended viewing.
Right, I'm going to be undertaking my inspection using the condition report inspection schedule as my framework, which really is the main change with regards to amendment number 1 of the 17th edition. Now we have several pages listing every item to be inspected.
The layout of the schedule of inspections really lends itself to a methodical approach to inspection, which allows you to work through the form, noting codes as required, and on the NICEIC form, also a location reference. The model form in Appendix 6 of the regs has 7 categories to work through. However, remembering that this is a model form, you find slightly different arrangements in practice. The NICEIC form actually has a couple of extra categories. For example, there's a section on current using equipment, such as electric showers, air conditioning units, or even, in this day and age, electric vehicle charging units.
The reason that this has been added is that fixed equipment was often overlooked in the original documentation because it was wrongly assumed that this was in the realm of PAT testing.
The first section which we'll be looking at, which is the same on both the model and the NICEIC forms, deals with the condition of distributor supply intake equipment.
So we're looking at the condition of the service cable, the cutout, the meter tails, which I'll also check at the consumer unit, the metering equipment and the means of isolation, if any. The kind of defects I'm looking for are things like damage to insulation, are there any cables hanging out here where live parts might be accessible, signs of burning, overheating, are cables properly supported, etc. Also that the supply is adequate and the meter tails sized correctly. Well, while I'm here, I might as well get the information to fill in on page 3 of the report. Well, I can see that the supply is TNCS, the protected device is 100 amp BS1361 type 2, which is very handy because it's written on there, and I do know that's got a short capacity of 16 kA. For older properties, this information can be difficult to obtain, and only after you've exhausted all routes of investigation would it be acceptable to put this as an operational limitation.
So there are no real issues with the origin of this installation. But one defect you may find on older TNS installations is that a BS951 clamp has been used as a means of earthing. This is probably because there was no previous means of earthing provided by the distributors. BS951 clamps are not designed to be connected to the armouring or lead sheathing of a cable and are an unreasonable means of connecting to the distributor's means of earthing.
It's important to say that at this stage, no outcome box on the schedule of inspections be left blank. A tick should be inserted if the item is checked and it is in an acceptable condition. An unacceptable condition will be categorised as either C1 or C2. Code C3 will be used to indicate if improvement is recommended. If the item was a limitation, then the letters LIM must be inserted, or if the item is not applicable, just NA.
If for whatever reason an item cannot be verified, the model form allows for a code NV to be used, which means not verified. But a word of caution, this should only be used in rare cases and cannot be used as an excuse not to carry out a procedure. In most cases, anything that cannot be verified must be an agreed limitation.
Please note that NV is on the model form but not on the NICEIC version.
Sometimes it will be necessary to indicate that further investigation will be required to decide whether an observation does pose an immediate or potential danger. The best practice guide states that if further investigation is required, then the overall assessment of the condition of the installation must be reported as unsatisfactory.
Back at the consumer unit, I can confirm that the meter tails are in good condition here as well. The next section is whether the property may have an additional source of power.
Here, this could be a backup power supply, such as a generator, which, if present, would need additional supply information recorded. Or it could be another source feeding into the installation, such as a microgeneration system.
To check the adequacy of a microgeneration system requires specialist knowledge, and it's likely that this will therefore be an agreed limitation, as we said previously. In this case, however, we'll be putting NA not applicable. Next, we need to check the earthing and bonding arrangements. First, the earthing arrangement. Well, the good news is that we've seen the earthing conductor connected between the supply at the intake and the MET, and it's in good condition. However, to actually verify that this installation does have an earth will require an electrical test that I'll do later, so I won't tick that box just yet. There's no earth electrode in this installation, so that will be NA, not applicable.
Next, we have confirmation of adequate earthing conductor size.
Well, as with most installation, it looks to me that the cable has been selected rather than calculated, because we've got a 16mm squared earthing conductor and the meter tails which are 25mm squared. So looking at the relevant table in the regs, table 54.7, we can see that 16mm squared is acceptable.
If the cable was smaller than that listed in the table, then you'd have to use the adiabatic equation in section 543 to check that the smaller conductor is acceptable and will be able to carry any prospective fault current without being damaged. We do cover the adiabatic equation in another video available on the Learning Lounge.
I can also confirm that the accessibility and the condition of the earthing conductor at the main earthing terminal is also satisfactory.
Next, we have the boxes referring to protective bonding.
First, I need to confirm the size of the main protective bonding conductor is adequate. In this installation, we have 10mm squared main protected bonding conductors running to the gas and the water installation pipes. The size of main protected bonding conductors is always selected from the appropriate table in the regulations, and 10mm squared is fine for most installations where the cross-section area of the supply neutral conductor is 35mm squared or less. The conductors are connected in an appropriate place for both the gas and the water installation pipes using BS 951 clamps, and are also suitably identified with the correct label. Where the installation has supplementary bonding conductors, which we might find in this house in the bathroom, these will also need to be checked for labels.
Absence of an earthing and bonding label would only be a C3 condition on the report, but absence of main protected bonding, if required by the regulations, would be a C2, as would absence of an effective means of earthing.
I'll point out here, Dave, that the reason absence of means of earthing is only a C2, that is not an immediate danger, such as an exposed live part. But don't forget that even a single C2 will result in an installation being an overall assessment of unsatisfactory.
As well as inspecting the presence of main protected bonding conductors, it will also be necessary to confirm their electrical continuity, which we'll do later. Our next list of items is concerned with the consumer unit. Well, there's not enough room for me to fit in the cupboard as well, even with Tony on his new high fibre diet.
Oh, you cheeky bugger. Ironically, the first thing on the list is adequacy of working space or access to consumer unit. In real terms, this isn't a great amount of space for a Sparky to work in, but it's better than many I've seen. I can certainly gain access to all the connections, so I think common sense will prevail here, and I will say the area is acceptable.
The next box is concerned with security of fixing.
This is referring to good workmanship, Dave. Has the consumer unit been mounted securely using appropriate erection methods? And in this case, it will be a tick.
Next, we have condition of enclosure in terms of IP rating. Here, the regulations require that the horizontal top surface of a barrier or enclosure, which is readily accessible, shall provide a degree of protection of at least IPXXD or IP4X, which is a hole no greater than 1 mm. Any other side must have a minimum degree of protection of IPXXB or IP2X, a hole no greater than 12.5 mm.
So what I'm checking for here, that there's been no modifications to the consumer unit, and that no wires can actually go in the top, no fingers can go in the sides or the bottom, and this is okay.
A common example of where it wouldn't be okay is, for instance, where a knockout's been removed to allow cable entry. Unfortunately, if this meant that a live part could be touched, it would have to be classified as a code C1 on the report.
Our next item is the condition of consumer unit enclosure in terms of fire rating. Now, this isn't a problem